a cold January morning in 2006, a young woman vanished from the streets of South London. Hours earlier, she had walked into her family's home, a place she no longer felt safe, a place where she had whispered to police again and again that her life was in danger. When her phone fell silent, her boyfriend knew something was terribly wrong. She had promised to call, but no message ever came. For days, he begged authorities to listen, to believe her warnings. Behind closed doors, her relatives spoke of her as missing. But the truth was far darker. The danger she feared was not from strangers outside, but from within her own bloodline. Somewhere, hidden from sight, her body was sealed inside a suitcase and carried more than 100 miles away. Buried under the earth in a stranger's garden, her voice, so carefully recorded on a video pleading for protection, was silenced forever. Her name was Banaz Mahmod. She was just 20 years old. And what happened to her would expose a chain of failures, a brutal murder at the hands of those she should have trusted most, and a reckoning that would change how Britain understood so-called honor killings.
Welcome to Dark Chronicles, where we uncover the most disturbing true crime stories in history. If you want more documentaries like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far these stories travel.
Banaz Mahmod was born in December 1985 in the Kurdish region of Iraq. She grew up in a large family, the second youngest of 7 children. Her parents had endured years of conflict and instability in their homeland, part of the Kurdish minority that faced persecution under Saddam Hussein's rule. Like many Kurdish families of that time, they longed for safety and a future free from political oppression. In the early 1990s, when Banaz was still a child, her family made the difficult journey to the United Kingdom. They settled in South London, joining a wider Kurdish community that had also left Iraq in search of security. The Mahmod family carried with them their traditions, their language, and their sense of cultural identity, while at the same time adapting to life in a new country. Banaz grew up in this environment, caught between two worlds. At school in London, she experienced the openness of a diverse city, surrounded by classmates who came from many different backgrounds. She was known as quiet and gentle, someone who blended easily with those around her. At home, she lived in a household that placed strong emphasis on cultural expectations and family honor. As a teenager, Banaz enjoyed the same things many of her peers did. She liked spending time with friends, visiting shops, and exploring her neighborhood. She was thoughtful, often shy, but carried a natural kindness that drew people to her. At 20 years old, she was still finding her place in the world, young, hopeful, and beginning to imagine what her adult life might look like. Life in South London shaped Banaz's identity. The streets, schools, and communities she grew up in gave her opportunities that had not been possible in Iraq. Yet, within her family home, the rhythm of life was guided by traditions and expectations that had been carried across continents. Banaz moved between these two spaces every day, the vibrant city that represented freedom and choice, and the private household where duty and obedience were emphasized. By the start of 2006, Banaz was entering adulthood. She was 20, living with her family, and beginning to make decisions about her future. Nothing at this stage suggested the terrible fate that lay ahead. Her life, like that of many young women her age, was defined by routine, relationships, and the simple desire to move forward in a country she now called home. In the Mahmod household, tradition and reputation carried great weight. Although the family had left Iraq for the safety of the United Kingdom, they maintained the customs and beliefs they had grown up with. Obedience to parents, loyalty to family, and strict protection of honor were central values. For daughters, these expectations shaped almost every aspect of daily life. Choices about friendships, dress, and marriage were not matters of personal freedom, but decisions tied to the family's dignity within the community. When Banaz turned 16, her parents arranged her marriage. The match was not one she had chosen for herself. Her parents considered the union suitable because the man was Kurdish, older, and in their eyes able to provide stability. For Banaz, however, the marriage quickly became a source of unhappiness. Life with her husband was marked by control and mistreatment. Violence became part of her experience, leaving her isolated and afraid. Speaking out was discouraged. Within her family, separation was seen as dishonorable, and women were expected to remain with their husbands regardless of how they were treated. For Banaz, that meant enduring a relationship that was harmful and oppressive, with little support for change. Honor in this cultural framework was not just personal, but collective. A daughter's behavior was understood to reflect on the entire family. If she resisted her role, if she tried to leave her marriage, it risked bringing shame not only on herself, but on her parents and siblings as well. Under these rules, Banaz's unhappiness was secondary to preserving appearances and family reputation. As the years passed, Banaz's struggle deepened. She was still very young, barely out of childhood, yet she was bound to a marriage where she had no power and little protection. She wanted relief from the abuse, but her family expected silence and endurance. Each day, she lived under the weight of two conflicting realities: the growing desire to live freely and the unyielding demands of tradition that insisted she remain in place. By her late teens, this conflict had become impossible to ignore. Banaz's marriage stood as the clearest example of how her family's cultural expectations clashed with her own sense of self. She was 20 years old, standing at the edge of adulthood, but trapped in a life that offered no real independence. It was within this struggle, between her search for safety and her family's insistence on obedience, that the next chapter of her story began to take shape. By the time Banaz reached her late teens, the abuse within her marriage had become unbearable. She was still only a young woman, but the years of mistreatment and control left her with no choice but to seek a way out. Separation was rare in her community and carried heavy stigma, yet for Banaz, remaining in the marriage meant continued suffering. Eventually, she made the decision to leave. It was not a step taken lightly, given the cultural weight attached to divorce, but it marked the first clear sign of her determination to take control of her own life. Banaz returned to her parents' home in South London. Though it offered her physical safety from her husband, it was not a space where she could live freely. Her family still expected her to conform to the same rules that had guided her marriage: obedience, silence, and sacrifice for the sake of honor. For Banaz, however, leaving her husband was more than just an escape from abuse. It was also the beginning of a search for happiness and autonomy. In time, she entered a new relationship, this time with a man she had chosen herself. The relationship was based on affection and personal choice, a sharp contrast to the arrangement that had defined her marriage. To Banaz, this was a chance to live as she wanted, to experience companionship on her own terms. Inside her family home, this decision was seen very differently. In their view, her separation already threatened their standing within the community. Beginning another relationship outside of marriage deepened their sense of humiliation. It was interpreted not as a young woman pursuing safety and love, but as an act of defiance against the authority of her father and the traditions they upheld. The tension grew steadily. Banaz wanted the simple things many people her age desired: freedom, happiness, and a chance to make her own decisions. Her family, however, viewed her choices through the lens of honor and control. They believed her behavior had crossed boundaries, bringing shame not only upon herself but upon them as well. The divide between Banaz and her family was no longer hidden. She continued to see her partner, seeking moments of independence in a life that was tightly monitored. Within the household, disapproval hardened into anger. To her parents and extended relatives, Banaz was challenging rules that were not meant to be broken. To Banaz, she was finally reclaiming a measure of dignity after years of silence. By the beginning of 2006, The struggle between Banaz's pursuit of freedom and her family's insistence on obedience was unmistakable. Each step she took toward independence seemed to widen the distance at home, setting in motion conflicts that could no longer be contained. As the conflict between Banaz and her family grew sharper, her sense of danger also increased. By late 2005 and into the beginning of 2006, she was living in fear. The disapproval at home had turned into open threats, and she no longer felt safe in her own surroundings. Unlike many in her position, Banaz chose not to remain silent. She turned to the police, believing that the authorities could protect her where her family would not. Between December 2005 and January 2006, Banaz went to the police on multiple occasions. On at least 5 separate visits, she reported that members of her own family were planning to kill her. She explained that her relationship with her boyfriend had been discovered, and that this was seen as a serious dishonor. She told officers directly that her father, uncle, and others within the extended family were involved in planning her death. One of the earliest warnings came after a violent assault by her father. In December of 2005, Banaz was attacked at her parents' home after they learned about her boyfriend. She managed to escape by climbing out of a window, running barefoot into the street. Neighbors called emergency services, and she was taken to hospital. There, she told police officers that her life was in danger from within her family. Despite the clarity of her account, the seriousness of her situation was not recognized. Instead of treating her account with urgency, an officer dismissed her claims. Banaz returned to the police again. On each visit, she repeated her fears, naming the relatives she believed were plotting against her. She explained that she had overheard conversations and had been directly threatened. Her statements were not vague. They were precise, naming who was involved and warning what they intended to do. At one point, Banaz even recorded a video message. Sitting alone, she spoke calmly but clearly about her situation. She explained that her family intended to kill her, and she named the individuals she believed responsible. It was not a dramatic outburst, but a measured account, made because she felt her words might otherwise be forgotten. Despite her persistence, the response she received from the authorities was limited. Officers listened, but they did not treat her claims as urgent or life-threatening. Her reports were noted, but little protective action followed. Banaz continued to live in fear, returning again to repeat her warnings, hoping that someone would finally intervene. By January 2006, her attempts for help had created a trail of warnings. She had made clear statements, given names, and even left a video testimony describing the threat she faced. Each time, she left the station with the same fear that had brought her there, still unprotected, still watched by the family she believed was planning her death. On the morning of January 24, 2006, Banaz Mahmod spent time with her boyfriend. She was seen leaving his home in Mitcham, South London, to return to her parents' house. For him, it was an ordinary farewell. He expected to see or hear from her later that day. When hours passed without contact, his concern began to grow. Banaz was usually in touch, and it was unusual for her not to respond to calls or messages. By the evening, the silence was alarming. Repeated attempts to reach her went unanswered. Her phone, normally a reliable link, gave no reassurance. Over the next day, worry turned into fear. Banaz's boyfriend contacted the police, explaining that she had not returned home and had stopped all communication. He stressed that her situation was dangerous, pointing to the threats she had described in the weeks before. For him, the silence was not simply troubling. It was evidence that something serious had happened. Within the family home, the story appeared different. Relatives outwardly acted as though they did not know where she was. They later made a missing persons report, telling authorities that Banaz had disappeared without explanation. At face value, this made it seem as though her absence was a mystery to everyone. But those who knew the background of her warning struggled to believe she had vanished by choice. The first days of her disappearance were marked by uncertainty. On one side, her boyfriend was pressing urgently for answers, telling police that Banaz had been living in fear of her own relatives. On the other, Her family presented themselves as equally confused, repeating that she was missing but offering little beyond that. What stood out in those early days was the sharp contrast between the concern of someone close to her and the silence within her own household. Banaz, who had spoken so clearly of her fears only weeks earlier, had now vanished. The lack of response, the absence of communication, and the conflicting narratives created an atmosphere of suspicion and unease. By the end of January 2006, the search for Banaz had begun. To those who had listened to her warnings, her disappearance seemed connected to the threats she had described. For others, it was still treated as an unexplained absence. The days following her last sighting marked the beginning of a case that would soon draw in both investigators and the wider public. On January 24, 2006, Banaz Mahmod had returned to her family's home in South London after spending the night at her boyfriend's residence. Inside that house, events had already been set in motion. The decision had been made by her father, Mahmud Mahmod, and her uncle, Ari Mahmod. They believed Banaz had brought shame upon the family, and they had resolved that she would not be allowed to continue living independently. That afternoon, Banaz was overpowered in the house. Before her life was taken, she was subjected to sexual assault by two of her cousins who had been enlisted to participate. It was part of the violence used to degrade and punish her before the planned killing. She was then strangled with a length of shoelace, a deliberate act carried out on the instructions of her father and uncle. The killing was not sudden or impulsive. It involved planning and the participation of other relatives who ensured Banaz could not resist or escape. Once she was dead, the men turned their attention to concealing what they had done. Banaz's body was forced into a large suitcase. The choice was practical. It allowed them to move her discreetly, away from the house, without drawing immediate attention. The task of disposal was handed to those they trusted to follow instructions without question. Over the next day, Banaz's remains were transported out of London. The suitcase containing her body was driven north to Birmingham, more than 100 miles away. The journey was part of a calculated attempt to remove her from her surroundings, distancing the crime from her home and the people who might have asked questions. In Birmingham, arrangements had already been made. The suitcase was taken to a residential property, where those involved set about concealing it. They buried the suitcase in the back garden of the house, covering the disturbed earth to disguise any sign of what lay beneath. For them, it was intended to be the end of the matter. Banaz silenced, her body hidden, and the family's reputation, in their eyes, preserved. Back in London, the outward appearance of normality was maintained. Her relatives spoke of her as missing, repeating the claim that she had simply disappeared. Behind that facade, however, they knew she was no longer alive, buried in a quiet corner of Birmingham, far from the streets where she had grown up. The killing and burial ended Banaz's life at the age of just 20. It was the act she had feared and spoken of in the weeks before. Carried out in secret, hidden behind walls, and then concealed beneath soil. When Banaz Mahmod stopped answering her phone in January 2006, her boyfriend knew something was wrong. Their relationship had been close, and communication between them was constant. It was unlike her to go silent, and he quickly sensed that her disappearance was not voluntary. In the hours after her last visit home, he tried again and again to reach her. Calls went unanswered, messages were ignored, and no explanation came. The silence only confirmed what Banaz had been saying in the weeks before. She believed her life was in danger. For him, the absence of contact was the confirmation of those fears. His alarm grew into urgency. He went to the police and explained that Banaz had vanished. He told them about the threats she had described, the fear she carried, and the warnings she had given about her family. He pressed officers to take her disappearance seriously, insisting that she would never cut off contact by choice. Days passed, and still, there was no word from Banaz. Each time he spoke with the authorities, he repeated the same points: that she had lived under threat, that she had already sought help, and that the situation could not be ignored. He made himself present, calling, visiting, and refusing to let the matter fade into the background of routine police work. His persistence was not only emotional, but practical. He provided details of her movements, the last times they were together, and the names of those she had said she feared. He recounted the night she had fled barefoot from her parents' home after being attacked, showing that her concerns were not vague, but rooted in real events. Inside Banaz's family home, however, the tone was entirely different. Relatives outwardly spoke of her as missing, repeating the line that she had simply gone away. To her boyfriend, this only deepened suspicion. He could not reconcile their indifference with the woman he knew, who had been terrified of her own relatives. In the fragile days after her disappearance, he became her strongest advocate. Where others hesitated, he insisted. Where silence prevailed, he spoke loudly. His determination made it impossible for her case to be overlooked. Without his constant pressure, the warnings Banaz had given might have faded with her absence. Instead, his voice kept her fear alive in official ears, demanding that the truth behind her disappearance be uncovered. The alarm raised by Banaz's boyfriend pressed the police to look more closely at her disappearance. What had first appeared to some as an unexplained absence now carried the weight of repeated warnings, a distressed partner, and growing suspicions about her own relatives. Detectives began to probe the family home, her relationships, and her recent movements. As officers examined her case, a clearer picture began to emerge. Surveillance evidence placed certain members of her family under scrutiny. Phone records revealed patterns of contact between her father, Mahmod, her uncle, Ari Mahmod, and a group of cousins at critical times around her disappearance. The frequency and timing of these calls drew investigators to the conclusion that coordination was taking place. One of the most decisive steps forward came from within the family itself. Banaz's sister, Bekal, agreed to cooperate with detectives. Living under the same roof, she had witnessed the threats, the discussions, and the hostility directed at Banaz. Breaking with the silence expected of her, Bekal told police what she knew. She confirmed that Banaz had been targeted by their father and uncle, and she named the cousins who had been enlisted to act on their instructions. Her decision to speak carried enormous personal risk, but it provided investigators with the testimony needed to press further. Through a combination of surveillance and witness statements, detectives were able to trace the movements of those suspected. In particular, they followed the journey of Banaz's cousins in the days after her disappearance. The use of vehicles, coordinated calls, and travel outside London drew their attention north toward Birmingham. Piece by piece, the disposal of Banaz's body was reconstructed. Banaz's body was not found immediately. It took investigators more than 3 months before they discovered her remains in April 2006, buried inside a suitcase in the garden of a house in Handsworth, Birmingham. The discovery confirmed what detectives had begun to suspect, that her disappearance was not voluntary, but the result of a planned and concealed killing. By February 2006, the investigation reached the point where arrests could no longer be delayed. Officers moved against the key figures: her father, Mahmod, her uncle, Ari Mahmod, and several cousins. They were taken into custody and questioned about Banaz's disappearance. While the suspects denied involvement, the weight of evidence, from records, surveillance, and testimony, held them firmly within the frame of the inquiry. The early failures to act on Banaz's warnings were now giving way to a determined pursuit. Detectives focused on recovering her body, securing physical evidence, and ensuring that the individuals named were held to account. The arrests marked the turning point from suspicion to action, shifting the case from a disappearance to a criminal investigation directed at her closest relatives. By mid-2007, the men accused of killing Banaz Mahmod were brought before the Central Criminal Court in London. The case was led by prosecutors who laid out step by step how her father, Mahmod, and her uncle, Ari Mahmod, had ordered her murder. Alongside them were cousins who had carried out the assault, the strangulation, and the disposal of her body. The trial was lengthy and complex. Prosecutors presented evidence gathered during the investigation, surveillance records, detailed timelines of phone calls, and witness testimony that placed each of the men at the center of the plot. They described how Banaz had been assaulted, strangled with a shoelace, and hidden in a suitcase before being driven to Birmingham and buried in a garden. Central to the case was the testimony of Banaz's sister, Bakal. She appeared in court wearing a veil to conceal her identity, a measure taken for her safety. Her evidence was direct. She told the court of the threats Banaz faced at home, the hostility shown by their father and uncle, and the conversations in which the killing was planned. Her words carried particular weight because she had lived inside the same household and had chosen to break the silence demanded by her relatives. The proceedings also revealed attempts by the defendants to silence those who might speak against them. Intimidation within the family was brought to light, showing how control extended beyond Banaz to others who were pressured not to cooperate with the authorities. The court heard how loyalty to family honor had been invoked as justification for her death. The defense argued that the men accused were not responsible, but the evidence presented undermined those claims. The coordination of calls, the surveillance records, and the consistency of witness statements established a clear chain of involvement from order to execution. In June 2007, the jury returned their verdicts. Banaz's father, Mahmud Mahmud, and her uncle, Ari Mahmud, were found guilty of her murder. They were sentenced to life imprisonment, with minimum terms set before they could be considered for release. Two cousins who had taken part in the killing were also convicted, each receiving lengthy prison sentences reflecting their role in the attack and concealment. In 2010, one of Banaz's cousins, Mohammed Saleh Ali, was extradited from Iraq, the first successful case of its kind between the UK and Iraq. In 2012, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction of Banaz Mahmod's killers did not close the public debate. Instead, it opened one. Her murder had exposed a chain of warnings that were not acted upon, and the failure of authorities to respond when she came forward again and again. For many, it was not only a family tragedy, but also a demonstration of how systems meant to protect vulnerable women could fall short. In the months that followed, police forces across the UK faced urgent questions. How had a young woman walked into police stations 5 times, named the people threatening her, and still been left without protection? Senior officers acknowledged the failings, and Banaz's case began to be used in training materials to ensure that such warnings would not be dismissed again. Detectives and frontline officers were instructed to treat reports of honor-based threats with seriousness, recognizing that cultural pressures and family silence often masked extreme danger. Her story also drew the attention of advocacy groups and campaigners. Organizations supporting women at risk of forced marriage and so-called honor violence pointed to Banaz as a symbol of why greater awareness and stronger safeguards were needed. They pressed for more outreach into minority communities, better support services, and legal measures that could intervene before threats escalated into fatal acts. The public response was equally forceful. Media coverage brought Banaz's name into national conversation, framing her not just as a victim, but as a young woman who had asked for help and been ignored. Documentaries, including Banaz, a love story directed by Diya Khan, later presented her own recorded words, ensuring that her voice was not lost. In 2020, ITV's Drama Honor revisited the investigation, reaching millions of viewers, and again, forcing the country to reflect on the case. The impact also extended into law enforcement practice. Caroline Good, the senior investigating officer on the case, used her experience to train officers across the UK and abroad, highlighting the need for cultural understanding in detecting and preventing honor-based crimes. Banaz's name became part of police instruction, a reminder of what could happen when early signs were overlooked. Her sister Bekal, who had testified despite enormous personal risk, remained in hiding under witness protection. To campaigners, her bravery stood as a parallel legacy of the case: the willingness to break silence even when it meant losing family and community ties. Banaz Mahmod's murder became one of the defining cases in Britain's approach to honor-based violence. It changed the way authorities understood such threats, reshaped police procedure, and placed new responsibility on institutions to protect those caught between personal freedom and family control. Through the coverage, the documentaries, and the reforms, Banaz's story continued to be told, not only as a tragedy, but as a call for change that could not be ignored. The conviction of Banaz Mahmod's killers did not close the public debate. Instead, it opened one. Her murder had exposed a chain of warnings that were not acted upon, and the failure of authorities to respond when she came forward again and again. For many, it was not only a family tragedy, but also a demonstration of how systems meant to protect vulnerable women could fall short. Banaz's boyfriend, Rahmat Suleimani, also carried lasting scars. His persistence had been crucial in forcing the authorities to investigate her disappearance, but the role he played brought him deep personal cost. Rahmat faced hostility and threats from within the Kurdish community in London. The trauma of Banaz's murder never left him. He eventually left the UK for Kurdistan, where the trauma and isolation continued. In 2016, a decade after her death, he died by suicide while in Kurdistan. His death underscored the enduring toll the case had taken, not only on Banaz, but also on those who tried to protect her. Banaz Mahmod's murder became one of the defining cases in Britain's approach to honor-based violence. It changed the way authorities understood such threats, reshaped police procedure, and placed new responsibility on institutions to protect those caught between personal freedom and family control. Through the coverage, the documentaries, and the reforms, Banaz's story continued to be told, not only as a tragedy, but as a call for change that could not be ignored.
Thanks for watching Dark Chronicles. If you want to go deeper into the world of true crime, watch this next story. And don't forget to please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more cases to light.